Imagine you walk out of your house and on your street you find a row of dominoes that stretch far beyond what your eyes can see. You start to hear a noise that gets slightly louder as time passes. This noise is familiar to you as you used to play with dominoes as a child. It is the sound of them falling. Eventually, you see this amazing display of falling dominoes approaching you. You greatly admire how the basic laws of physics can produce such a remarkable spectacle. However, you're also saddened because the last domino has now fallen a few inches away from your feet. Still excited about what has just happened, you decide to walk down the street to find the first domino, hoping to meet the person responsible for producing this wonderful experience. Keeping the above scenario in mind, I want to ask you a few questions. As you walk down your street, will you eventually reach where the chain of dominoes began? Or will you keep on walking forever? The obvious response is that you will eventually find the first domino. However, I want to ask you why. The reason you know that you will find the first domino is because you understand that if the domino chain went on forever, the last domino that fell by your feet would have never fallen. An infinite number of dominoes would have to fall before the last domino could fall. Yet, an infinite amount of falling dominoes would take an infinite amount of time to fall. In other words, the last domino would never fall. Putting this in simple terms, you know that in order for the last domino to fall, the domino behind must fall prior to it. And for that domino to fall, the domino behind it must fall prior to it. If this went on forever, the domino would never fall. Sticking with this analogy, I want to ask you another question. Let's say walking down the street, you finally come across the first domino which led to the falling of the entire chain. What would your thoughts be about the first domino? Would you think that this domino fell by itself? In other words, do you think the falling of the domino can somehow be explained without referring to anything external to it? Of course not. Clearly not. That runs against the grain of our basic intuition about reality. Nothing really happens on its own. Everything requires an explanation of some sort. So the first domino's fall had to be triggered by something else. A person, the wind, or a thing hitting it, etc. Whatever this something else is, it has to form a part of our explanation of falling dominoes. So to sum up our reflections thus far, neither could the chain of dominoes contain an infinite number of items, nor could the first domino start for no reason whatsoever. This above analogy is a summary of the argument from Dependency. The universe is somewhat like a row of dominoes. And let me explain further why. Here is the basic argument, brothers and sisters and friends. Number one, the universe and everything that we perceive is either independent, dependent on something else dependent, or dependent on something independent. Okay? Number two, the universe and all that we perceive cannot be independent or dependent on something else dependent. Number three, therefore the universe and all that we perceive depends on something independent. And if this thing is independent, it has to be eternal, which I'm going to explain later. Now you may think, oh my God, too many dependent, independent, this guy's rapping. It's like a philosophical rap. Let me explain this further to you. The way to understand this is first to define what we mean by dependent. And it's not really in line with the kind of popular use of the term. There is a certain specific understanding of the word dependent in the Islamic classical tradition and also in Western philosophy. The first defining aspect of dependent is that it is not necessary. It is not necessary. Now you may be arguing, well, what does necessary mean? Well, necessary means it was impossible for it to have not existed. Something being necessary means it was impossible for it to have not existed. So things that are not necessary did not have to exist. This is what we mean by dependent. For example, look at this book. Is this book necessary? Was it impossible for it to have not existed? It was possible that it couldn't have been written at all, right? There's nothing necessary about the existence of this book. So what we're saying is this book is not necessary. It didn't have to exist. For example, maybe it could have not been written, or I could have forgot it at home. This book that I have right now. There could be a number of different explanations for its existence. So the point here is there is nothing necessary about this book. What we perceive about this book is that it could have not existed. When we perceive this book, we don't come to the conclusion that it was impossible for it to have not existed. There is nothing necessary about this book. Let me give you another example. Imagine you're really hungry at night and you go downstairs to the kitchen and you open the fridge, and inside the fridge you have an egg box. And on top of the egg box you find a pen. Now, let me ask you a question about this egg box and the pen on top of it. Was it impossible for it to have not existed this way? Of course not. It is possible for it to have not existed at all. In actual fact, it could have been arranged in a different way. Why was the pen on top of the egg box and not in the egg box? Right? Why was the pen on top of the egg box and not underneath the egg box? In actual fact, why is the pen there at all? In actual fact, why is the egg box there at all? What we perceive about the pen on top of the egg box is that it didn't have to be there. And therefore, it requires an explanation. How did the pen get there? There is an explanation for why the pen is there. There is an explanation for why the egg box is there. So from this point of view, something being dependent means it is not necessary. It is not necessary. It is not necessary from the point of view that it did not have to exist. The pen didn't have to exist on top of the egg box, and the egg box didn't have to exist. It could have been there in a different way, or it didn't have to be there at all. So, first basic definition of what it means to be dependent is that it is not necessary. It could have been otherwise. There is nothing necessary about the existence of these things. They could have not existed at all. Second definition of dependent. The basic components or building blocks of something could have been arranged in a different way. So the basic components or building blocks of something could have been arranged in a totally different way. Let me give an example. Back to the same analogy I gave you previously. Imagine I'm driving past a roundabout, and on the roundabout it's all grass and there's an arrangement of flowers. And the flowers say, I love you. I love you. Okay? Now those arrangement of flowers, could they have been arranged in a different way? Of course they could. They could have been arranged, I adore you. Right? Or the Greek, c'est arabo, I love you. Or the French, je t'aime, I love you, right? Or the Turkish, seni seviyorum, I love you. Whatever, it could have been in a different language. It could have been arranged in a different way. There is nothing necessary about that particular arrangement. And so what's very interesting here, since it could have been arranged in a different way, there must have been something external to that arrangement that gave rise to the arrangement. There must have been something external to the arrangement that gave rise to that arrangement, because there's obviously some kind of choice, or there is an alternative option to arrange those flowers in I love you, to arrange those flowers in se arabo, to arrange those flowers in seni seviyorum, or to arrange those flowers in je t'aime, or to arrange those flowers into I hate you instead of I love you. That could have been a possibility. It could have been arranged in a different way. So it means there must have been something external prior to that arrangement that gave rise to that specific arrangement. So that's the second definition of dependent. Its components or fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. Third definition of dependent, and this is the most easiest one because this is the natural, intuitive understanding of dependent. That something relies on something outside of itself for its existence. Take, for example, a cat. A cat can only survive if it eats food. So it relies on something external, food, in order to stay alive, right? Just like me. I need food, right? Absolutely. I need something external to myself in order to exist. That's a very basic definition of dependency. The other defining feature of what it means to be dependent. This is the final point. Dependent things have limited physical qualities. Dependent things have limited physical qualities. Take this book, for example. It has a certain shape, certain size, color, even temperature, right? It's not that cold, right? So it has a limited shape, size, dimension, volume, color, temperature. It has limited physical qualities. Now, if something has limited physical qualities, it can't really give rise to its own limitations. Did this book give rise to its own limitations? Did this book give it itself the color? Did this book give it itself its size? Did this book give it itself its temperature? Did this book give itself its dimensions? No. Its limited physical qualities are as a result of something external to it. Because you could always ask the question, why is it this size and not another size? Why is it this color and not another color? Why is it this temperature and not another temperature? We need to explain the limited physical qualities of this book. It doesn't explain itself because this book didn't give rise to its own limited physical qualities. There must be something external to it in order to give rise to its limited physical qualities. Even this bottle. Did this bottle give rise to its own limitations, limited physical qualities? Did this bottle give rise to its certain dimension, volume, color, shape, size, temperature? Did it? No. Therefore, there must be something external to it that gave rise to its limited physical qualities. Does that make sense? And that you can apply to anything that has limited physical qualities. Whether it's a bus, a planet, an atom, a quark, a quantum field. Anything physical has limited physical qualities. Therefore, there must be something external to it that gave rise to its limitations because it cannot give itself those limitations. Khalas. Mic drop, as they say, yeah? Do you know what that means, mic drop? No? It means you've made a point that no one can refute. Anyway, that's a youth thing. So, let's apply the definition of dependent that we just discussed to the universe, okay? So let's go back to the argument again. Number one, the universe and all that we perceive, actually we'd even address this. So let's apply it to the universe, yeah? Number one, here is an option. The universe and all that we perceive are eternal, necessary and independent. That's one option. Second option, the universe and all that we perceive depends for its existence on something else, which is also dependent. That's an option. Number three, the final option. The universe and all that we perceive is dependent for its existence on something else that exists by its own nature, that is accordingly eternal and independent. Let's address each of these options. Number one, the universe and all that we perceive are eternal, necessary, and independent. What you've learned about the word dependent now, is this true? Why? Exactly. Brilliant. It could have been different. And we even know this in science. Speak to any cosmologist, anyone studying the universe. The universe could have been different. It could have been arranged in a different way. It could have had even different physical laws. Right? There's nothing necessary about the universe itself. There is nothing necessary about the universe itself. And this is very important for us to understand. There's nothing necessary about the universe. It could have been arranged in a different way. Therefore, the universe requires an explanation. Why is the universe the way that it is? In actual fact, this is a key question in cosmology, a key question in philosophy. The famous polymath, Leibniz, he said, why is there something rather than nothing? Absolutely. So the universe is not independent because it's dependent because it's not necessary. Also, the universe is dependent because the fundamental building blocks of the universe, whether you think it's a quantum field or quantum energy or quantum haze, whatever the science, it's irrelevant. But if you bring something physical into it, it has a particular arrangement. The fundamental building blocks of the universe have particular arrangements. Those arrangements didn't give rise to themselves. There must have been something external to the arrangement that specified that arrangement. It's simple. So again, the universe is dependent. The universe is dependent from that point of view. The universe has limited physical qualities. Even the fundamental building blocks of the universe has limited physical qualities, whether it's a planet or a quantum field. They have limited physical qualities. And as we discussed, things with limited physical qualities can't give themselves these limitations. There must have been something external to them that gave rise to those limitations. So the universe is definitely not independent. It's definitely not necessary from that point of view. So the first option is not an intellectual option. Second option, the universe and all that we perceive depends for its existence on something else which is also dependent. Why is this not a rational explanation? So let me repeat the potential option here. The universe, all that we perceive, depends for its existence on something else which is also dependent. Why is this not a feasible intellectual option, solution? Well, think about it. Say if this universe was dependent on another universe, and that universe was dependent on another universe, and that universe was also dependent on something dependent, which is another universe, and that went on forever. We have an infinite regress of dependencies. Will we ever have our universe? Think about it. If there is an infinite regress of dependencies, we will never have our universe. If I said to this brother, can you please help me hold this book? It's too heavy, right? But before he holds the book, he has to ask his dad for permission. He's dependent on his father's permission. But before his father can give his son permission, his father also has to ask his father for permission. If that goes on forever, will he ever help me hold this book? No. Similarly with the universe, if this universe is dependent on another universe, which is also dependent on another universe, and that goes on forever, you have an infinite regress of dependencies, you will never have the universe in the first place. So it basically is impossible that the universe is dependent on something else dependent forever. Now you may argue, well, it could be that the universe is dependent on something else dependent, and then it stops somewhere. Fine, we don't have a problem with this. Even in Islamic theology, some interpretations of Islamic theology, before the cosmos and the universe, there was smoke. So there was something that the universe was dependent on. We don't have a problem on that. What we're saying is, it stops at something independent. The ultimate explanation cannot be that the universe was ultimately dependent on something dependent. No. Somewhere along the line, there must have been something that is independent. So, the only way, brothers and sisters and friends, to explain things that are dependent is by referring to something that is not dependent and therefore necessary. So what's very important is this. That it leads to the conclusion that the universe is as a result of something that's independent. Not only is the universe explained by something independent, that it's dependent on something independent, but that independent thing has to be eternal. Because if it wasn't eternal, it's finite. If something is finite, it requires an explanation, therefore it's not independent anymore. So you have an independent, eternal thing that the universe is dependent on. Even if the universe was eternal, no problem. the argument still works. Even if you were to say, yeah, but the universe is eternal, no problem. Something could be eternal, but still be dependent. Take, for example, an eternal chain of parents and children. There's an eternal chain of parents, children, parents, children, parents, children. Eternal chain. It's eternal. There's nothing independent about that chain, because you could go to each part of the chain and ask, how did that child come into existence? Why is that child there? What's that mother doing there? Why is that father there? Could that father have been another father? Could have been. There's nothing necessary about his fatherhood. There's nothing necessary about her motherhood. There's nothing necessary about this child being born in this chain, in this eternal chain of family, right? Also, they have limited physical qualities. They didn't give rise to those limitations themselves. There must be something external to them that gave rise to those limitations. So even if that chain was eternal, there are aspects of that chain that still give us really good reasons to believe that it's dependent. So whether the universe is eternal or not is irrelevant. The fact is that even if it was eternal, it is still dependent. So, all that we sense and perceive depends for its existence on something else that exists on its own nature, that is independent, and it is eternal. Let me explain why again. Number one, it has to be independent, because if it were dependent, it would also require an explanation, and we're going back to the same problem. Number two, it has to be eternal, because if it was not eternal, it's finite. And we know finite things are dependent, because finite things that begin, things have finite limitations, they require an explanation. This is in line with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Himself in the Quran. When Allah says, Allah is independent of all that exists. Allah, God, is independent of all that exists. Allah also says in the Quran, O mankind, it is you stand in need of Allah, whereas He alone is self-sufficient. Al-Ghani, He is rich, independent. The one whom all praise is due. Now Ibn Kathir, the classical commentator, he said, they need Him in all that they do, but He has no need of them at all. He is unique in His being, free of all needs, and has no partner or associate. And this is very important for us to understand, brothers and sisters and friends. Also, the famous surah in the Quran, when Allah says, قُلْ هُوَ Allahu ahad. Allah say, Allah is uniquely one. Uniquely one. Allahu samad. And He is self-sufficient. This word, self-sufficient, is a very profound word in the Arabic language. Not only does it mean self-sufficient, not only does it have connotations of God being independent, but also God being indivisible, free of any need, being necessary, existing. That one word is a summary of everything that we said. Now, finally, before we end, there are some contentions from our beloved brothers and sisters in humanity when we talk about this argument. And the first contention is, well, maybe the universe exists independently. The universe is necessary. Well, this is not a valid contention. We know this because when we understand what the word dependent means in this context and we apply it to the universe, we know the universe could have been different. It could have not existed, and it could have existed in a totally different way. The fundamental building blocks of the universe have a specific arrangement in some form. There must have been something that specified that arrangement. The universe is full of limited dependent things. The universe is full of things that have limited physical qualities. Those things can't give rise to their own limitations. Therefore, there must have been an external set of factors that gave rise to those limitations. So we see that the universe doesn't exist independently from that point of view. The second contention is a contention that you hear from the 1960s, I believe, from the grandfather of neo-atheism, Bertrand Russell. I think it was on a radio debate and program on the BBC. He said, get over it. The universe is a brute fact. You'll have no explanation. Ignore it. And the minute you ignore it, you'll have a better life. I'm just summarizing the kind of understanding here. Now that's false. Because think about this. Imagine we go to the park. What's the nearest park here? Cambridge Park? Kelsey Park. Parker space is called. That's an interesting name for a park. Parker space. So we go to Parker space and we're playing, and all of a sudden we see a hovering green ball. It's hovering. There's a hovering green ball. Do you look at the ball and we say, look at that hovering green ball. It exists independently. It's necessarily existing. Its existence explains itself. Is that what we say? No. What do we say? How is that happening? We need an explanation for this hovering green ball. Because it has limited physical qualities, it requires an explanation, there's nothing necessary about its existence, it could have been arranged in a different way, it didn't have to be there at all, so we're applying this understanding of dependency on the hovering green ball. Right? Rightly so. Okay, get that ball, now make it into the size of Jupiter. Same questions apply, right? Now get that ball, make it to the size of the universe. Same questions apply, right? So how can you say the universe is a brute fact? And what's very interesting, for you to say this, you undermine science. Because there's a whole field of science trying to answer the question, why is the universe the way that it is? It's called cosmology. That contention is absurd, because if you apply it consistently, give up your science, give up your philosophy. Third contention, the final one. And you always hear this. Hamza, this is a typical theist argument. It's called God of the gaps. You don't know about the science of the universe. You're primitive in your understanding, or we're primitive in our understanding. There is a gap in scientific knowledge, so you squeeze God in there as an explanation. You hear this all the time. It is the most overused, outdated atheist cliche all the time. It's so overused. This has nothing to do with science. This argument loves science. It says, Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome science. You could bring anything. Say there are 50 universes. Say there are a million universes. Say there are multiverses, many, many universes. We don't have a problem. Say there are different laws of physics. Say whatever you want. But the minute you bring science is the minute that this argument still absorbs it. Why? Because anything you bring scientifically is always going to be dependent. In actual fact, science can never discover something independent by the nature of the method of science. Because as Professor Elliot Sober, an atheist, philosopher of science, he's a philosopher of science, he says scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. One of the key methodological restrictions of science is what? Observation. If you observe something, what you observe is going to be independent or dependent. It's going to be dependent, because anything you observe is going to have limited physical qualities. It's impossible from our limited senses to observe something that doesn't have limited physical qualities. So that's the point. So any science you bring, you could couch it in any scientific language, use any complex terms, multiverse, many worlds model, whatever you want. Our argument still stands, because those things will still be dependent by the definition that we just discussed. So it's not God of the gaps at all. It's prior to science. Bring any science involved, we don't have a problem. We don't have any problem. We will still require an explanation for what you will bring. Is it dependent or independent? It's dependent. How do you explain that dependency? What we've just discussed is ultimately it's explained by an independent and eternal being. And that's best explained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.